It was a discovery made not in myth, but in a laboratory. Ancient DNA extracted from early Mesopotamian elite remains had revealed something no one expected. A genetic marker, rare and anomalous, appearing precisely where the oldest traditions of kingship and divine authority converged. The Sumerians called their skyborn rulers a gift from the Anunnaki, powerful divine beings who, according to their oldest texts, had descended from heaven and handed civilization to the first kings. For centuries, scholars read those words as poetry. Now, with biology asking questions the tablets never answered, that reading may need to change. The question is no longer only mythological. The field of ancient DNA research has rewritten history more than once in a single generation. What began as an attempt to recover fragmentary genetic material from well-preserved specimens became, in the span of 2 decades, one of the most powerful tools in the historian's arsenal. Researchers can now extract usable genomic data from teeth, from petrous bone, from the dense inner ear structures of individuals dead for 5, 8, 10,000 years. The results have repeatedly overturned conclusions that seemed settled. Enter the ancient DNA revolution, and with it, a new kind of question about the oldest civilizations on Earth. The evidence had already surprised scholars, scientists, and historians in ways no one anticipated. The spread of early farming across Europe, once understood as a gradual diffusion of ideas, turned out to be a migration of people, a wholesale population replacement visible only because the DNA said so. The Yamnaya expansion from the Pontic-Caspian steppe rewrote the prehistory of half a continent. Egyptian royal mummies, sealed in their cartonnage for 3 millennia, yielded genetic profiles connecting the pharaonic dynasty to populations across the ancient Mediterranean world. In every case, the biology knew something the texts did not say. It was within this context that a team analysing remains from elite burial sites in the ancient Near East encountered something unexpected. The remains were linked to early Mesopotamian sites associated with the administrative and priestly class, individuals whose burial goods, grave architecture, and material culture placed them at the uppermost stratum of one of the world's first organised civilizations. Standard population genomics proceeded without incident. Ancestry components were identified, migration signals were noted and logged, and then, in a subset of individuals, a genetic marker appeared that did not belong to the expected regional profile. The marker was not a sequencing error. The team ruled that out through standard verification procedures. What it was, precisely, was a variant pattern of low frequency in the surrounding ancient population, appearing at a statistically elevated rate among the individuals associated with elite lineages. Rare variants appear in ancient DNA regularly. Most are unremarkable. This one drew attention for a single reason: its distribution, when mapped against comparative data sets from other ancient Near Eastern sites, clustered in a pattern that suggested it had not drifted into the population at random. It appeared where power appeared. It appeared where the records described a boundary between ordinary human rulers and those whose authority was said to originate somewhere other than the Earth. The researchers did not claim the marker proved anything about mythology. That is not how population genetics works, and the scientists involved were careful to say so. But they noted the correlation. They published the observation, and they left the interpretation, as scientists often must, to a question the data alone could not answer, at least not yet. Enter the Sumerian king list. It survives in multiple copies. The most complete is a clay prism now housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, inscribed in cuneiform during the early 2nd millennium BCE, but recording traditions understood to be far older. The text opens with a line that has unsettled readers for over a century. Translated from the Sumerian, "Kingship descended from heaven." Before the great flood that reorganized the ancient world, the list records a sequence of rulers governing from cities named Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Their names are given, their cities are given, their reigns are given in units that stretch across tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, the first king named, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor Al-Aljar reigned for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total governed before the flood, accumulating 241,200 years of combined reign between them. Modern scholarship has not taken those figures literally. The numbers almost certainly encode something else, a symbolic system for expressing dynastic legitimacy, or a cultural memory of an era so remote it had passed beyond the reach of ordinary chronology. What scholars have not been able to dismiss is the theological claim embedded in the record itself. These were not ordinary rulers. Their kingship was not a human institution that developed gradually through political competition and social complexity. The earliest rulers, as the Sumerians understood it, had received their authority from a source above. Kingship had arrived whole, legitimate, and divine from somewhere that was not the earth. The beings credited with that gift were the Anunnaki. In Mesopotamian religious tradition, they were not peripheral figures. They appear in the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives known to scholarship, predating the biblical account by over 1,000 years. They appear in the Atra-Hasis epic, which records the creation of humanity and describes the Anunnaki as divine administrators, powerful, named active beings who shaped the conditions of civilized life and entrusted its continuation to the kings they appointed. Scholars, archaeologists, and ancient Near Eastern specialists have debated their precise nature for generations. What the texts agree on is their origin. The word itself in Sumerian carries connotations of sky, of above, of those who come from the heavens. The genetic marker had appeared in the bloodlines of individuals buried at the intersection of all three: kingship, temple authority, and the oldest layers of Mesopotamian elite identity. The tablets described a boundary between human and divine rulers. The DNA had found something at exactly that boundary. What the genetic data showed, when mapped against the broader ancient world, was a distribution pattern that resisted easy explanation. The marker appeared in the Mesopotamian elite sample at a rate several times higher than in the surrounding non-elite population from the same period and region. When researchers cross-referenced it against comparative ancient DNA datasets from other early civilizations, early dynastic Egyptian remains, Indus Valley skeletal material from sites associated with the Harappan administrative class, and burial populations from the Fertile Crescent more broadly, a pattern emerged that was difficult to attribute to random genetic drift alone. The marker was not unique to Mesopotamia. It appeared, at lower but detectable frequencies, in populations that shared one characteristic. They were associated with the earliest organized expressions of hierarchical authority, the priestly and ruling classes of civilizations that invented writing, monumental architecture, and the institutional state. Geneticists, archaeologists, and ancient historians noted the overlap independently. None claimed it was conclusive, all agreed it was worth asking about. Responsible interpretation demands precision here. Population geneticists are careful to note that shared genetic markers between geographically distant populations can reflect ancient migration, intermarriage between elite lineages across trade networks, or a common ancestral population that contributed to multiple regional founding groups. The marker may describe a migration corridor, a group of people who moved through the ancient Near East in the 4th or 5th millennium BCE, whose descendants rose to positions of institutional power across multiple early civilizations, and whose biological signature persisted in the bloodlines of ruling families long after the original movement was forgotten. This is a grounded interpretation. It requires no mythology to sustain it, but it does not explain everything. It does not explain why, in every civilization where this pattern appears, the ruling class was described in religious terms as categorically different from ordinary humanity. It does not explain why the Sumerians attributed the origin of kingship specifically to beings from above, rather than to conquest, lineage, or accumulated political power, all of which they understood perfectly well and recorded in other contexts. And it does not explain why the Anunnaki tradition, with its specific theological framework of skyborn administrators of civilization, appears in the Sumerian record nearly fully formed, with no clear mythological predecessor leading up to it. Enter the cultural memory hypothesis, associated with scholars including Jan Assmann and debated across the fields of ancient history, cognitive archaeology, and religious studies. The framework proposes that ancient mythologies do not simply invent their central claims, they preserve them, transformed by time and retelling into the language of the supernatural, but grounded in something that was once experienced as real. Under this reading, the Anunnaki were not a poetic invention. They were a memory of a group possibly biologically distinctive, possibly organisationally sophisticated beyond the local norm, whose presence in the ancient Near East was so consequential that it became the founding narrative of civilization itself. This interpretation is not mainstream within academic ancient Near Eastern studies. It is a claim the available evidence cannot yet confirm, but it is not refuted by the evidence either. Science does not deal in impossibilities. It deals in what can and cannot be demonstrated. And what the ancient DNA has demonstrated is that the oldest known bloodlines associated with divine kingship carried something unusual, something that connected them, faintly but detectably, to populations beyond their immediate geographic origin. The tablets record a transition. Before the flood, kingship was vast in its temporal scale, cosmic in its authority, connected directly to the Anunnaki and the divine order they administered. After the flood, something changed, the reign shortened dramatically. The kings became recognisably human in their dimensions. The connection to the Anunnaki grew more distant, more mediated by temple ritual, priestly institution and inherited ceremony, as if the original source of authority had withdrawn, leaving behind only its institutional echo, and it now appears a faint biological trace in the people who claimed its legacy. The oldest question civilization ever asked is not whether the gods existed. It is why the first kings were different. Every early civilization independently arrived at the same answer. Their authority came from somewhere else. The Sumerians named that somewhere. They called it the Heavens. They called its inhabitants the Anunnaki, and they built the world's first cities, the world's first written law, and the world's first astronomical observatories in the shadow of that belief, as if maintaining an inheritance they did not fully understand but knew they could not afford to lose. Ancient DNA cannot tell us who the Anunnaki were. It cannot confirm that the beings described in the Eridu Genesis and the Atra-Hasis epic were real in the way that the researchers who sequenced those Mesopotamian remains are real. What it can do, what it has done, is place a biological question mark at the exact location where the oldest written tradition on Earth places its most extraordinary claim. The science and the mythology are pointing at the same place. Neither has yet explained what is there. Thanks for watching. If this raised more questions than it answered, that is exactly where the best history lives. Like and subscribe to keep exploring the discoveries that continue to reshape everything we thought we knew.